It's mikevsbeer at Old Nation Brewing Company. This brewery is known for brewing some of the best beers on the planet. They have such hits like M-43, like their Summer Shandy, like their Tart Strawberry M-43, their Low Orbit, their Boss Tweed IPA. Their specialty, although not limited to, but their specialty is definitely hazy New England style IPAs. I'm absolutely excited to take the tour. I'm absolutely excited to share this interaction with their staff, with all of you. So let's head on inside and see what they got for us. Welcome to Breweries of America. I'm mikevsbeer. I've got Travis Fritts here. He is a co-owner and the head brew master of Old Nation Brewing Company. We are in Williamston, Michigan. I'm so excited for this tour, Travis.
I'm happy to have you here. It's really great to see you.
Yeah.
I'm excited to show you around.
Yeah, and I love right off the bat, pan on this tiny real quick, that M-43 sign. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that beer really put Old Nation on the map, as saying this is a top-notch, like world-class New England style juicy IPA brewing.
I think that it did. That it certainly wasn't our intent when we went into business to do a new style of IPA. For sure, it was our intent to open this place up and explore some of the traditional styles that we've made as apprentices and journeymen throughout the, at that time, about 15 years of experience we'd had, my brewing partner Nate and I, in the brewing industry. But times changed and we followed, and New England IPA was the vehicle that took us where we are now.
And if you ever have had the pleasure of having an M-43, you know what I'm talking about. It's got this beautiful opaque body. It almost looks like orange juice.
Yeah.
It's not thick, but you can't see through it, and it's just delicious. It's fantastic, great lacing, great flavor profile. Well, if you don't mind, I guess now is a perfect time to check out the brewery.
Yeah.
You guys are gonna love this. I saw Williamston and I was expecting a smaller operation, and then when I walked in the door, I'm like, holy cow, you put out some volume.
Yeah,
so let's check it out. I'm excited to bring y'all with.
Yeah, happy to do it. Let's go.
Oh my God, you come in here, this is what heaven smells like. I'm convinced when I get to the pearly gates, it's gonna smell like this.
To me, this this smells like a Saturday. Nothing's going on, but it smells like a good brewery. And Nate Rixey is my brewing partner and has been for, I think, since 2007 we've been working together. He went to UC Davis, worked in Alaska for a long time, in California in the early 2000s. We've both been brewing for about 23, 24 years professionally. Nate is the kind of guy, as I am, that really like to sort of dig as deep as we can into what we're doing, right? It becomes more interesting the more you know about it. The experience of drinking beer and experience of brewing beer and how different ingredients affect the final product is obviously a part of your development. The great thing is, once you've had that development, a lot of research and development in a practical brewery can be largely conceptual.
This isn't something haphazard that you stumble into.
No.
It is a very controlled process, and a lot of respect to the knowledge and wisdom that gets gained over decades of experience.
That's what it is. I think it's common for people to look at brewing and be like, man, that would be awesome, right? I would love to do that. Because I love beer and you're around beer all the time, you get to create, and that's true. But it's a job, and more than just being a job, I think what I was lucky to get, being a student in Europe and working under European masters, was the idea that I'm part of a very long lineage of tradespeople that goes back to, women in Egypt and Central Europe and Great Britain, and then the transfer of that knowledge to the more commercial breweries that opened up, from churches in Europe and largely the Catholic Church, of course, in Europe, and how they commoditized beer, and then how that commoditization became a scientific pursuit because the expanse of distance that the beer had to travel was so much greater. I'm just part of that, right? And it's a trade, and so going in and being like, man, I'm going to be a punk rock star and make a beer with chocolate in it, and it's going to be dope because it's 10%, my brother-in-law likes it, is awesome. Getting $5 million and putting your entire life on the line in order to try that for 1 million people, is different.
Yeah.
And it should be, right? That's the difference between amateurs and professionals, I guess, is the risk you take.
Yep, absolutely.
This is our 4-vessel system. This was commissioned to be built in Lake Orion, Michigan. We got to be able to be part of the design of the brew house. Up until, really the mid-90s, the model of any brewery opening was you decide on 2 or 3 beers. They'd all be about the same alcohol content. So they would all have the same gravity, which means sugar content of the wort going into the tank, which means that the systems were made to that spec. Our idea of efficiency before we opened up the brewery, which I'm really glad we did, because we're not making traditional 11.5 Plato beers. We're making 18, 20, 15, 8 Plato beers all over the place. So the process starts at the mill back there. It's a 4-roller mill. You'll see super sacks there of wheat and oat, and then there's a large barley malt silo, a 60,000-pound silo outside. And then those whole kernels are drawn into the mill, which goes through 2 sets of rollers. And then once that malt is crushed, it goes into our Lexon hopper, and then that's sort of the on-deck circle, and then the at-bat circle's up here in the stainless hopper. There's water coming into this collar where the grain falls through, which is called conditioning water. And essentially, the brewer will come in the morning. The brewer the previous day or the previous shift will have already milled the grain. So the brewer's first step is going to be to recirculate the hot water tank to make sure that's an even temperature. And then we'll lay a foundation of water, begin to introduce the malt by dropping it through this aperture. And then through this aperture, conditioning water will come in to further add water and make sure the malt doesn't clump, which is important. What we're looking for is uniformity throughout the process in every case. So uniformity of substrate is particularly important in this step because, of course, in the mash, we are controlling in large part, if you're hitting all of the basics, then the nuance in hitting all the bases means hitting your alpha amylase rest for starch conversion into sugar that's fermentable by the beer, which is sort of the basic necessity of malting. So the more opportunity we have to play with temperature, to raise temperature, and do these steps throughout the process, the more control we have of the finished product. That all happens in the mash tun. Once that's done, the entire mass of mash then will be transferred into the lauter tun, which is probably the most interesting looking vessel inside. It's got a bunch of stuff in it. The point of the lauter tun then is to separate these solid materials, husk, grits, etc., from the substrate that contains the sugar and therefore the color that we're looking for, right?
It's like an industrial washing machine almost. It just kind of is moving everything around.
I think a pretty good way to conceive of this for folks who are new to brewing is as like a drip coffee filter. That's pretty much what we're doing, right?
Okay.
So you'll see the false bottom, the little slits that are cut in the false bottom. You'll see the rakes that move around to keep the grain bed loose so that it's permeable and water can flow through it. The thing that we're doing here from an industrial perspective is sucking the life out of the grain as much as we can without pulling stuff that we don't want. So the more efficient this process is, the better, which means the temperature of the water has to be at exactly, for example, 171 or 172 degrees, right?
Within 1 degree.
Within 1 degree. If we're doing less, we're not extracting as much as we could. If we're doing more, we're pulling polyphenols from the grain husks that make it taste like a Band-Aid. It's gross. This is the kind of stuff that we're doing here in the lauter tun. So the grain mass goes here, the mass of the husks, etc., which have to be specifically milled there in order to set up a permeable in the mill, in order to set up a permeable filter bed. We'll set on top of that false bottom. The liquid will collect underneath. The first step is recirculation, what's called Vorlauf by a lot of brewers, which is a German word for pre-running. Those will be cast back over the top of the bed until they're traditionally they said newsprint clear, so you'd have a sight glass when you could read the paper through the sight glass. It was clear enough. We are a little bit more specific than that now, but honestly it's about the same thing.
Sure.
And then once that clarity is reached, that liquid begins to be pumped into the kettle, which is here. And that process takes about an hour and a half. So once we have dropped the bed, created a little bit of hydrostatic pressure in there, we'll begin then again to spray water over the top. That process is called sparging. That strips the rest of the sugar and proteins that we want, and some we don't then, out of the grain. And then that mass of liquid, which is now called wort, will be collected in the kettle. And again, this process takes an hour, hour and a half. And once the kettle is topped off, the boil will begin. And the boil is, that's all that happens here, right? But it is crucial that that boil is as vigorous as possible.
Nice rolling boil,
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Not only rolling, but you'll see in the center of that tank we have what's called an internal calandria. There's a cone, just a stainless steel sheet cone that sits on top of that calandria that you can see there. That calandria is steam heated, so it's essentially increasing just the function of convection as heat, is dissipated and reintroduced inside the kettle. And then as it shoots up out of that calandria, it bounces off this cone and spreads out in a kind of weird jet all around this kettle. The reason that's appropriate is because we've got a few different functions boiling serves. Sterilization is one of them, obviously. Conversion of alpha acids into isoalpha acids of the hops is another one. Colloidal protein generation is another one. But maybe the most important one, or certainly one of the most important functions of boiling, is evaporation. Ton of sulfur in grain, for example, right? If you're not, sulfur is a volatile compound, it's very easily boiled off. The more surface area you create by this calandria spreading that wort out as it jets up, the more evaporation you have, the more sulfur you drive off, the more volatiles you drive off, the cleaner beer you have at the end. Once that's done, we're casting hops, by the way, throughout this. Depending on the beer, we'll have 3 to 5 hop strikes. Terminal hop strike is generally in the whirlpool. Most brewers do refer to that as a whirlpool strike. That will be after the wort has generally dropped from about 213, 214 degrees Fahrenheit to about 197 to 202 degrees. That's more like steeping with tea.
Yep.
So we're not blowing off any aromatics from those hops, or not much. We're capturing as much as we possibly can in that step. The whirlpool is essentially exactly what it sounds like. This wort is pumped into the whirlpool tangentially. It creates an action like a whirlpool. Just like if you stir a cup of tea and the leaves end up in a pile in the middle.
Yep.
Same thing's happening here. It's no more intense than that.
Okay.
But all this plant material from the hops, all this colloidal protein that's been happening, kind of looks like egg drop soup in the boil, is then collected in this cone in the center of the whirlpool. Clean wort is drawn off the side and then goes through our heat exchanger, and we can kind of go down and look at those. I suppose, yeast is the pivot point of the production process, right? It goes from processing raw materials in a way that is pretty standard across beers and not too difficult. The machines do a lot of it for you, to a trillion living cells that God knows what they're up to right at that moment, unless you're keeping really close track, right? The system that we have for yeast engenders an ability for us to control this as closely as possible, like the rest of the brewery. So that's what this setup is for. There's a stir stick in there, there's oxygen that's injected, it's on load cells so we can tell how much we got. We're doing cell counting, all that. In really basic terms, what we want to do is know how many viable cells of yeast we have per milliliter, and how much sugar per milliliter we have, which would be our gravity rating in the wort, and then how much of that wort that we have. And then that equation is pretty simple. It's this much then slurry for this much beer, right? But we want a certain amount of cells per unit of gravity per volume. And having healthy cells is what's most important. When I was an apprentice, what all my old masters said, one of the 3 things that they all said that was the same was the first job of a brewer is not to give anyone a hangover they don't deserve. Meaning, if you have 12 of my beers and you get a hangover, that hangover's on you, right? If you have 3 of my beers and you get a hangover, that's because I didn't attend to the health of my yeast before I pitched it and during the fermentation
I've never
process.
heard that before, but I totally appreciate everything you just shared there.
Having the yeast that is pitched into any batch of beer be as close to its first generation as is possible. So one of the ways to do that is to do what's called acid washing, which is taking a mass of pH that you're going to pitch down to a very low pH, killing any bacteria or unviable cells off and leaving only healthy cells behind. The other way is to do the traditional open fermentation top cropping. So yeast is going to be in high kreuzen when it's most active and it looks the coolest while it's fermenting with these like meringue peaks. And when that's happening, that's called high kreuzen, and that yeast is then as healthy as it's ever going to be. The process of top cropping, which is taking that foam and repitching it into another beer as yeast, is the process of keeping that yeast in its first generation. We're refreshing our yeast for every batch of beer that we make, in order to ensure that it is as healthy as possible throughout the process.
And that's why you get such quality beer.
It's controllable.
Like, it's
in that
awesome,
way, right?
Yeah.
It's controllable, and the consumer can know what to expect. So in any event, we're taking that healthy yeast. Our cellarman then will have generally centrifuged the beer in this piece of equipment, which is our centrifuge. All of our beer is centrifuged. The New England IPAs particularly are centrifuged. The idea there is to take the heavier yeast cells out and leave the lighter protein haze in.
Nice, yeah.
So definitely the most expensive piece of equipment in the brewery, definitely the most high-tech piece of equipment. We've got a hop recirculator here, which is essentially just a way for us to make an anoxic environment around the hops we're using to dry hop in the fermenter, and to recirculate them in the fermenter for as much contact as possible. Primary fermentation is going to take roughly 4 days or so. Secondary fermentation is going to take another 8 to 9 days. Then we're going to let the beer relax. Generally, it's going to take a day in the brew house, 17 days in the fermenter, and another 3 or 4 days in the tax tanks before it hits the cans. These are either 80 or 120 barrel tanks. So to put that into scale, in the larger 120 barrel tanks, if we're packing those out into cases, that's a 53-foot truck trailer full of cased beer. Our cellarmen are taking, pH readings, they're taking gravity readings, they're taking all different kinds of oxygen readings all the time throughout fermentation. But once that beer hits the tax tanks, those flat bottom tanks or bright tanks, all of that is done, right? As soon as the beer leaves the yeast, it's only going to get worse. So our job up until the end of the fermenter is to make the beer better. Our job from the bright tank until it gets to your neck is to make sure it doesn't get any worse than it was at the last moment it got better, right?
And freshness is key.
For me, that function of oxygen ingress is probably what we spend the most time and money on in the brewery, is controlling that. So making sure that everything is tight, the hoses are tight and clean, the pump heads are tight and clean. There's no way for oxygen to get in that. And furthermore, in these open fills, almost every fill in a brewery is an open fill. You can have larger rotary machines that do what's called the double pre-evac, but it's almost impossible to get all of the oxygen out of a can. The packaging line is a relatively simple packaging line, but we have modified this packaging line intensely. So each pallet of cans, which you'll see behind you, would be introduced into this part of the machine called the depalletizer. It does what it sounds like it does. It's just taking these cans off the pallet and putting them into the line. Once the cans come off the pallet, they're blown out with an air knife. We're blowing air into the can to blow it out instead of water to rinse it, because the introduction of water actually is introducing more potential oxygen into the finished product than air.
H2O,
right? So when we go down from there, it's passing under a UV light, and then it's passing into the actual filler, which we can walk around here and see. So the filler is actually split into 2 ranks. There's a front rank here, which is the fill rank. There's 2 ranks of 10. And then there's the evacuation rank behind, which is 2. So the can, which is 10 again. So the cans will come in units of 10. They'll hit the back rank. CO2 will very slowly and in a very controlled way be pumped in to create a blanket of anoxic environment underneath. There is still some oxygen, nominally at least, in the can, so it'll be very gently transferred forward and then filled from the bottom up, pushing all that air out until there's a pellicle, a little bit of foam on the top.
So essentially, when that happens, you're displacing O2 with CO2.
Initially.
It's heavier. So it's literally pushing, you can't see it, but it's pushing the oxygen out. You're filling it up. You have this can of carbon dioxide. And then the beer then displaces the CO2.
That's right. And the process is relatively standard and should be transferred among breweries. The devil is in the details of what's happening in that displacement, right? So how many eddies are happening within that blanket of CO2, you know what I mean? How many eddies then are happening as it fills? These are all things that we need to control as much as we possibly can. So we have pieces like this, right? It just looks like a hunk of metal. It's actually a capillary diffuser. It's about a $4,000 piece of equipment. This is a
$4,000 hunk of metal,
Yep.
and it's not silver or gold.
Nope. And it's a capillary CO2 distributor. So it's these tiny streams of CO2 that are pouring out of this, so that when the beer passes under it, from the time it's filled until the time it hits this knife, which cuts off the top foam that's been exposed to air and drops the cap on, and then is sealed by this. There's no further oxygen ingress, right?
You think of it like everything we've been through.
Yeah.
If you don't get this 10-foot area, it's all garbage.
It's all garbage.
Like, this is so critical.
This is everything.
I love it. This is awesome to see.
And you'll notice that the guys that run the packaging line even are way more intense than anybody. You know, the brewers are the least intense generally because, you know, you mess up, you probably fix it, right?
It's just boiling.
Cellar people are more intense because if you mess up real bad, that's 40 grand a beer you lost. That's a problem.
Yeah.
These guys are extraordinarily intense, and you'll see them here, you know, cutting into cans and, you know, with shakers and taking oxygen readings constantly, and that's what this process is. It's just, you know, 100,000 opportunities to have a failure in the seaming of the can lid, or the travel of the, you know, how the can traverses from here to there, whatever. And these guys are on it. It's a really high pressure job.
Yeah. It's so cool to see.
But once it's seamed, assuming it all goes well, which it does, you know, 99.99% of the time, it's then rinsed in this unit and then shot into here, which is a very old Canadian-sold, Chinese-made labeler from the mid-90s.
Yeah.
We've been rebuilding this machine constantly for about 8 years now, and it runs just exactly the way that we want it to.
Oh, wow.
And that's true for most of the equipment in here. Most of this equipment I kind of collected over my brewing career, and then, you know, kept because it was particularly good for one purpose or another. And then this brewery's given us the opportunity to further refine all that machinery into what we want it to be. So is it pretty? No. Does it work like insanely well? Yes. And that's what we want, right?
It's beautiful. Was this the predecessor label to the me?
My, yep.
Or is it my?
Yeah, that's what we say. Okay. I mean, anybody who's got enough money to pay for a 4-pack can call it whatever they want. But
yeah, you're not known for having budget beers.
No, we're
but
not.
They're excellent.
I mean, you know, like we say, it's the raw materials that we use are expensive because they're good. The processes that we use are time consuming, and so that's expensive. Mm-hmm. If the beer didn't match up to the price we were charging, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. Right now, I sleep really great.
Yeah.
So,
and people, you know, they vote with their buying dollars.
They do.
And they vote consistently for Old Nation over and over and over again. That's how you have.
That's how we have it.
15 fermenting takes, or 16, 17 fermenting takes. It's awesome.
But even philosophically, it increases your degree of difficulty, right? Mm-hmm. Because you know that you're asking good money for good beer.
Yeah.
And if you're not meeting that good money with good beer, then that's that.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't take their time deciding they don't want to work with you anymore. So we're happy that this system has resulted in that kind of success.
This whole process is interesting. That's why we're doing this. Like,
Right.
there's so much to be learned, and so many people are enthusiastic about it. Not everybody gets to come up here and get a tour from you.
That's true.
On a Saturday.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
we want to
Yeah.
bring the tour to them.
Yeah, we're usually playing baseball.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, there you have it. Old Nation Brewing Company, Williamston, Michigan. We got Travis Fritts. Thank you so much.
Oh, I love that.
I mean, your generosity of your time. You got a family. You got baseball to go to. They got, look at the restaurant is packed. They probably opened 15 minutes ago, and everyone is coming here already. This is a normal Saturday for these guys. But for you to make time to explain everything, share your knowledge, not with just me. The point of this is to share it with all of you. So I hope that we get a lot of views, draw a lot of attention to Old Nation. You guys get some of their latest, greatest, and enjoy it. It's some of the best beers in the world, or on the planet, as your website says.
Thank you so much, man.
Thank you, Travis.
Thanks very much.
This has been awesome.
I really appreciate you coming. Thank you.
An ungracious plug, if you have a taste for shandies, you'll find none better than the Old Nation shandy.
Thank you.